Good afternoon. It is an absolute honor to be gathering with you on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is also an incredible honor to be sharing the stage with these two women. Gurmayagat, thank you. I'm going to start very high tech with this. The reason I'm doing this, I have been known, and I didn't tell the conference organizers this before they asked me to speak. I've been known to shut down electricity when I speak at conferences. I've blown up lights, computers, etc. So I'm sticking to a piece of paper for the first part. They also told me I had about a 15, 20-minute slot. They obviously also don't know me. As an Irish woman, it takes me that amount of time to say hello. 35 years of serving children, young people stands in front of you, so strap yourself in. I'm going to somehow squeeze 35 years into that. When I was sitting listening to my colleagues, I could hear a baby. Now, I'm hoping there is a baby in the room and I'm not hearing voices, because wrong audience to tell that you're hearing voices. The beauty for me of hearing the baby, the sound of a baby in this room, it's the reason why I stand in front of you. And I hope that I just honor the story of 35 years of work. Because unfortunately, in Australia, as we gather, 355,000 notifications of child abuse, 164,000 were investigated, and 70,000 were substantiated. For those of us who've worked in child protection, we know that that 70,000 hides a vast number of children who have not disclosed the fact that they have been abused. It's extremely difficult to tell adults that adults have abused them. In a geopolitical setting, those figures would be called a humanitarian crisis. Not in Australia. Hence the reason why I returned to big school, university, to look at child abuse as a human rights issue. The World Health Organization, its figures talk about 1 in 4 adults internationally being subjected to physical abuse, and 1 in 6 and 1 in 13 men being subjected to sexual assault. Again, those figures hide vast numbers of children and young people who can't speak up. If we start in thinking about the babies and then moving towards childhood and adolescence and adulthood, babies come into this world extremely vulnerable, 100% dependent upon adults who are charged with loving and nurturing them. There is no more vulnerable position to be in. And yet the very adults charged with that sacred contract violate it. As babies, the effects of abuse range from damage in the internal organs, broken bones, failure to thrive, brain damage. That, unfortunately, is where you come in. Right through to, in adulthood, we know the connection, and the World Health Organization particularly has done research in this area, the connection between a history of child abuse and cancers, lowering your immune system, higher rates of obesity, suicide, intake of alcohol, drugs, eating patterns. Again, often these conditions that will present to you in emergency. I've been told that there's 3,000 people attending this conference. And I can tell each and every one of you that at some time you will care for someone who has had or is having an experience of trauma. For some of you, it may be obvious. It may be the broken bones or the internal organs that you're dealing with. For a lot of us, it's not. It's the hidden costs that will come out, certainly in physical manifestations, but hidden costs that had long-term consequences. That, to me, is a humanitarian crisis. That, to me, is everybody's business. Our children come into this world not just vulnerable to the family, but vulnerable to us in society. And so when I think about effects, I know I've mentioned some of the biological effects. For me, it's the bigger message of child abuse. Ter, who's one of the great forerunners in bringing trauma to notice, talked about two types of trauma, type 1, type 2. Type 1 trauma is a one-off event, which certainly knocks your homeostasis out of balance, and you have some effects, but relatively easily, you swing back in physically, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually back into harmony. Type 2 trauma is a reoccurring pattern of events, which leads to more complex symptomology. Think about family life. Think about how we judge a good parent. We judge a good parent by someone, for example, who puts in good routines to a child's life. A recurring pattern of events is what family life is. Put within that, like the babushka doll, that this recurring pattern of events is abusive. And from that, it's not just the diagnosis of type 2 trauma, it's the story. The enduring story that it leaves with you when the people who are meant to be charged with loving you and protect you violate that sacred contract. You will hear me say that a few times. The story leaves three clear messages. A message about the self, a message about relationships, and a message about this beautiful world that we live in. The message about this beautiful world that we live in is it's unsafe or chaotic or uncertain. And so the children and young people that I have worked with have either dual relationship with this world. They're either frightened of it and don't venture into it to experience all the wonders that it has, or they risk take. And the risk taking may lead you to their door. And then what we do with children and young people who present like that, generally as a society, we do two things. We either medicalize their suffering or we criminalize their suffering. But we certainly do not take responsibility for it as an adult society. The other message about the self is that the self is unlovable, unworthy. It must be the people that society charged with looking after me, the person, parents, abused me. So there must be something about the me that is unlovable and unworthy. And that story continues throughout life. Last year, I had the honor of working with an adult survivor. He was a very wealthy businessman in his mid-50s, had everything that one would think would make one happy. And he was sitting on one sofa, and I was sitting in the other, and he's banging his chest and going, "Mary Jo, what was it about me that was so unlovable that they beat me so much? What was it about me?" That message, that effect of trauma stays. And at some point, each and every one of you will care for someone like that. The third message is about relationships. And for me, it is the most fundamental, important thing that I learned about serving children, young people, and adult survivors of trauma. Because the day I got this message was a day I changed my practice. I was forensically trained, I was clinically trained, I was an investigative officer. It was, thankfully, through being taught by children and young people, that this lesson is ingrained with deep, deep, deep within my heart. Because the message of relationship is, don't trust it. Why would you? Why would you trust a person in power over you? A person who's charged with looking after you? A person who's charged with helping you, nurturing you? Why would you trust that? And when I got that realization, I thought, that's your job, Mary Jo. You're in power, a position of power over children. You're in a relationship which should care, which should nurture, which should heal, and inherent in that same relationship of the abuser is my work. And so I had to ingrain within that something very, very different. It was up to me to restore that relationship about the untrustworthy adult in power. Certainly from my work, and maybe for some of you, for me to be effective, I must invite children and young people and adults into a relationship, a therapeutic relationship. It's like saying to someone who's frightened of spiders, for example, go into that room full of spiders and sit there quietly and be a good patient, be a compliant patient, and do everything you can to make my job better while you're in a room full of the very thing that you fear. When children, young people, adult survivors come to see me, and certainly when they'll be seeing you in your role, that's what we're asking them to do. We're asking them to enter again into a relationship of trust and care and healing, and to be a compliant patient and client. The day I got that is the day that my practice changed. And so my tips for you in thinking about the children, young people, and adult survivors that you may be caring for, because they mightn't necessarily come to you as a result of first stage trauma. It could be as a result of cancer or any of those other factors I talked about earlier. So it's not necessarily the trauma up front that you're caring for, but it's the person. So your tips, your 4 tips. T, trauma is real in the lives of children, young people, and adult survivors. Do not do what one psychiatrist did to an adult survivor I was working with and tell her that her trauma story was part of her psychosis and she was making it up. Or dismiss the fact that their suffering, while you may not be able to see it externally, exists. It does exist. So your belief is a first step in helping them to heal. The I is for the realization that trauma instills within the people, the children, young people, and adults, this disbelief in themselves and this mistrust in adult professionals. And your I is to invigorate trust again. You are so powerful beyond your medical qualifications. The power lies in the human relationship. I have had the pleasure of trawling through literature searches, and those researchers in the room know what a joy that is. You read article after article. Apparently my son said that my swearing has increased since studying for my PhD. I said, I don't think so, son. As I read and go, what the bleep, bleep, bleep? Oh, incredible. Trawling through this massive amount of literature, I've been collating what patients and clients have been saying about professional service delivery, because that's my human rights framework, is participatory research. Not once has a client or a patient talked about, and certainly in my profession, any of the evidence-based practices that we used. The descriptions they use about us in the room are things like respectful, kind, caring, listened to me, took my views into account, etc., etc., etc. Some of the most inspiring stuff I'm reading is from the cancer world, and particularly in Dublin. I want to meet this woman one day. She's a nurse who looks after children who are dying from cancer. And it's been an incredible inspiration to read not just the clinical side of her work, but the incredible compassion that she brings to these dying children, while she's continuing to have to do the day in, day out. I can only imagine the day in and day out that you face every single day. But the speed of what you have to do and the crisis nature of what you have to do should never get rid of compassion. Ever, ever, ever. The P from the tips is the person. There is a person within the patient that you are seeing. Several years ago, I was standing in a shower in a hospital here in Sydney with a stoma nurse holding up my broken body. As she was teaching me to fit my bag, and we're not talking Gucci, darling, it was the only bags I was used to. I'm crying. I'm looking at this alien organ hanging out of my body as she's trying to teach me. And as I'm crying, she kept saying, there, darling. There, darling. Keep crying. And she kept going. She taught me. And I was able to look after myself from then onwards. Still doing her job, but I have never felt more dignified and more beautiful in my life at my most broken and my most ugly. That's what you can do for people. And the S, the final part of the tips I'm going to leave you with, is to hold on to the sacredness of the work that you do. I'm not talking religious. I'm talking the sacredness of what you bring into this world, considering that there are people that bring death and abuse and violence into this world, and you don't. And when you're doing this sacred work, hold on to the sanctity of the person you're serving, the patient in front of you. Guru Mayagat, Guru Mayagat, Guru Mayagat.